call an information night because we're going to be looking at a whole lot of material. So basically just keep your head down and write, and you'll be okay. It's probably what you do most of the time anyway. Bible translations again. Bible translations. And I said this evening we were going to start on what we're going to call a theory of translation. A theory of translation, and we'll probably look at it twice this evening then. And I'm going to base the study on this sentence. A Bible translation is only as good as A, B, and C. A Bible translation is only as good as A, the accuracy of the underlying text, B, the skill of the translator or the translationist, borrow the phrase from the other fella, C, the philosophy of communication adopted. So I didn't know it was that difficult. Well, it is that difficult. A lot of people have the naive notion that, well, they think if I knew Greek as well, or in Hebrew, depending on what testament or both we're talking about, if I knew that as well as I knew English, then I'd find me a Greek Bible or a Hebrew Bible, and I'd pick that up and I'd read that Greek word, masabasabo, and then I would know what that meant in English. And then I would get that English word and put it down there on the paper, and that would be it. It's not nearly that easy. It just doesn't work that way at all. That's only part of what comes into the picture. Obviously, if you don't know Greek or Hebrew, you'll never be a translator when it comes to the Bible, that's for sure. But that's just a part of it. A lot more is involved. These three things in particular, the accuracy of the underlying text determines how good the translation will be. The skill of the translator, you could have a perfectly reliable text. You could have one as reliable as the autographs and give us some numbskull to translate it. And we'll end up with something that's not anywhere near the autograph. The skill of the translator, and you can put in parentheses an S, skill of the translator or translators, and we'll discuss that probably in the third message. It's the skill of the translator versus translators, singular plural. And thirdly, the philosophy of communication adopted, and that's probably what will be the most difficult aspect of it, the philosophy of communication adopted. Now, we're not going to just breeze through this. We're going to take our time to get through this, and we're going to end up with our own theory of translation. We're going to look at other theories of translation and see how they pan out with ours, or maybe to be more humble, how ours pan out with theirs. And obviously, we'll assume that we're going to pick the better of the options that are available. So I would say these three things. You'll sometimes see that maybe two of these things, 1 and 2, or 1 and 3, or 2 and 3, or something, make up one's theory of translation, but I think it will appear rather obvious to you now, and you'll see it more as we go along, that we're going to take a combination of these things. It depends on what text we're using, how reliable it is. If you start at point A with an unreliable road map, then whenever you get to point B, it's an unreliable trip, if you even get there at all. So obviously we have to start with something good to end with something good. The process, as we're going along, then 2 and 3 come in. The skill of the translator, we got a good text underlying this process of translation. Now, how good is the translator? How qualified is he? Where is his field of expertise? In what field does that expertise exist? And at the same time, his philosophy of communication. What type of philosophy of expression he adopts is going to come out in the translation, and it can make it anything from a structured, woody translation to a free paraphrastic one, still using a reliable translator, still using a reliable text. But this last thing is where really, one thing we'll really have to look at, where it really throws people for a curve as far as various translations are concerned. Now I want to begin then, we're going to go through these in order, looking here at the first point. A Bible translation is only as good as the accuracy of the underlying text. Now, most people, and some of you still think this way, and that's why we're going to do a little review here for a few hours tonight. It's going to be review, addition, and subtraction in the area I'll share with you here in a moment. But most of you still think of the Bible, and it's hard. I'm not chiding you. It's hard not to think of the Bible this way. You think of the Bible as basically an English book. That's the aspect of the Bible that you're most familiar with. You have a Hebrew Bible. Most of you, maybe all of you, some of you anyway, familiar with. You're most familiar with your English translation that you use. And it's very easy to pick up this subconscious view that the Bible is an English book written to English men. Now, I know I've said just the contrary over all these years to you, but still, in the back of some of your minds, that's what you think. Well, if I've just got a Bible and it's written in English, that's the big thing now that I have a Bible. Not necessarily. How reliable is that translation, that version that you're using? Just how reliable is that? It's going to depend on a whole lot of things. Number one, that was used as the basis for this version or translation which you're presently using. And that was not an English text, that's for sure. Well, let me take that back. Some of them were. It depends on what version you're using. Some of them were kind of a combination of a Hebrew and Greek text or manuscripts and some earlier English edition. Or if you're talking about Spanish, an earlier Spanish edition that was used and compared and things correlated and corroborated to end up with this present version. Some people even have the super naive notion that the King James Version of the Bible is really the only version of the Bible. It depends on how you got brought into this Christian experience, but that pretty much is what I was confronted with. No one said that to me, but that was just kind of what you picked up. The King James Version of the Bible is the best-selling book. We're not talking about version, book, any type of book, secular or sacred. The best-selling book of all time. Most often read, most often published, most often sold. King James Version of the Bible. You try to put yourself back in that frame reference of your mind, and some of you are to some degree still there now. And the King James Version of the Bible. Let me just share a little secret with you. They think this way down at Faith Assembly. They have a King James Version theology down there. They do a deep study of the Word of God by comparing English words in a concordance found right in the King James Version of the Bible. And I've even heard Dr. Freeman say on tapes before that the King James Version, it has its faults, but basically it's the best translation available. And, I beg to differ. And I think any scholar that exists out there, except for a couple who have something to prove, would beg to differ as well. And the evidence will prove one way or the other who's right and who's wrong. But I've listened to enough of their messages. I know it's based on a King James Version of the Bible, and it's a King James Version theology. So you have to divorce yourself from that notion. You have to be satisfied in one sense of the word that you at least have a Bible that you can read. That was what we were talking about last time, the importance of translations. Either God's going to have to give us a reversal of the Tower of Babel, put us all back to Greek, Hebrew, or English, the universal language today, so that we only need one translation in one language. Either we're going to have a reversal of the Tower of Babel, or we're going to have the need for Bible versions and Bible translations. And think of this for a moment. Some people think, some of you might have thought, boy, if I just knew Hebrew perfectly, if I knew Greek perfectly, there were no case endings, there was no form of any conjugated verb that gave me any trouble at all. I knew it all perfectly. Well, obviously, we wouldn't need to use an English Bible anymore. We could go right to Hebrew and Greek then. But I'd be preaching in English, though. And so every time we tried to use the Hebrew or the Greek in order to preach from it, I have to translate the Hebrew or the Greek into English then. We're doing just the reverse then of what we said we really wanted to do. In other words, the only thing that you could get to is you'd have to be a Hebrew-Greek, and you could speak both languages and would preach in both languages. And obviously, that's an impossibility. That's an impossibility for most peoples in the world. So don't think that it's a disgrace to use a translation of the Bible in another language beside the original. That obviously is what most people in the world have to do. And there's nothing wrong with that. As long as we're not duped with this notion that this is the Bible. This is the very manuscripts, or at least an immediate copy of them. Totally perfect, totally reliable. That Paul, Moses, the rest of the prophets and apostles sat down and wrote. That's the common misconception among lay people. And you might think this is simple what I'm saying, but it's too widespread. It should not be as widespread as it is. I suppose because of the supremacy of the KJV over so many centuries now, 4 centuries, that it's been difficult for people to get away from it. More than that, it's been difficult for pastors, evangelists in the pulpits to make any derogatory comments about the KJV, because they were raised on it, their mother was raised on it, their grandmother was raised on it, their great-grandparents were raised on it. And you think of this as what? The sacred, holy Word of God. Every jot and tittle inspired in here. We saw last time inspiration is only for the autographs. The dotting of the I's, the crossing of the T's, in your version, in whatever version. It could be a Greek version. And guess what? It's not reliable, it's not inspired, as were the autographs. Some people think if I just had a Greek Bible and I could read all of it, well, so what? You still have to deal with all the variants, though. You still have to deal with all the problems, no matter what language we're talking about. Of all these manuscripts and translations and versions that exist, we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of them. You want to hear a surprising fact, which you probably already know? There are no 2 alike. No 2 alike. Of all the thousands, we got 5,000 Greek manuscripts available. Some of them containing whole books, some of them almost the whole New Testament. There are no 2 alike. No 2 alike. Because remember, all those come the days before the printing press. That's what helped to standardize things. But guess what? You can pick up almost any book from the printing press, and there are mistakes in it as well. At least whatever's in that edition will be in all the other books that came from that edition as well. You'll have some that are like there. The printing press can't even keep everything straight because it's still dependent on people. I'll show you something here about that in a moment. So, in looking at the accuracy of the underlying text, that brings us to the topic of textual criticism then. We've done an extensive study on this before, and we're going to look at it again. And I said we'll see 3 things here. We're going to do it as review, as addition, and as subtraction. Review, because I just think it's necessary to go over some of these statistics again, because all of this, remember, is in preparation for some of the concluding remarks we'll get to about Bible translations. And you have to be able to prove things before you can say, now, this is the translation to use, and that is the one not to use. And the first step in proving which is proper and which is not proper to use, or reliable or not reliable, and that's a relative statement anyway, would be a study of textual criticism, the accuracy of the text. It's been quite some time since we were here in this area, and it's a fascinating area to me, and just the review of it will probably help remind you of these things and help you remember them further. It will involve subtractions as well. Obviously, we're not going to say tonight all that we said over all those many months. Most of that's on tape and hopefully in your notes somewhere. And so we're going to leave off a lot of that. And additions, most of the passages we look at, not all of them, but 70%, maybe more than that, will be new that we haven't looked at before. Ones like Romans 8:1 and so forth we've looked at many times before, although we'll comment on those as we have need of that as well. So we're going to be looking at textual criticism again to prove the things that I want to prove. In other words, what we're going to be looking at now for the next few hours will join what we're going to be doing in the future. This whole theory of translation, and then looking at the Bible translations with that long study we did in textual criticism. Otherwise, you just have to go back and repeat everything that we said there in order to be up with where we are right now. Textual criticism. Let me start by giving you a few reference titles here. Again, some of these are old, some of these are new. Some of them are new because they've just been published. One book that's almost indispensable as far as the Old Testament text is concerned. And by the way, most of what we're going to say tonight has to do with the New Testament text. And I'll tell you why here in a moment. That is Ernst Werthwang's book, The Text of the Old Testament, which I think I've brought and mentioned on many occasions before. It's almost indispensable for an introductory book. It's not a scholar's book, it's a layman's book. It helps to be able to read Hebrew, though. A lot of it is written in Hebrew. But Ernst Werthwang's The Text of the Old Testament is almost indispensable as far as I'm concerned if you want what I think would be something for your level of understanding as a primer or an introductory handbook for Old Testament textual criticism. Obviously a German theologian. Ernst Werthwang, The Text of the Old Testament. I've read this book I don't know how many times. It's not a novel, that's for sure. One is, stiff and stodgy as this. Anything written by, a seminary professor has to be stiff and stodgy. Well, I've read it I don't know how many times. I even made my wife read it because it's a good book. She didn't grasp all of it, but I made her read it anyway. You read that or otherwise. Counterpart. I'll pass it around. You can take a look at it if you want to. Counterpart for the New Testament. I don't think I brought this last time. The text of the New Testament. It's transmission, corruption, and restoration. A more thorough book, by the way, than Worthwain's book. It's dealing with a smaller section of the Bible. Notice the New Testament, not the Old. By B.M. Metzger, Bruce Manning Metzger, famous Princeton theologian. Well known for New Testament textual studies. Probably the leading authority in that area. Bruce Metzger, M-E-T-Z-G-E-R. New Testament again, this is a good primer by Harold Greenlee, An Introduction to New Testament Textual Criticism. Again, it helps to be able to read a little Greek if you want this, but I've read this I don't know how many times as well. Greenlee. Greenlee was one of the ones on the committee for the UBS Greek translation. Introduction to New Testament Textual Criticism by Harold Greenlee. And then something that I've just come across because it was just published, and I just devoured the book. It's lively in the way it's written. It's enjoyable. It's very readable. It's another book by Greenlee, and it may be more on your level. It's entitled Scribes, Scrolls, and Scripture. A Student's Guide to New Testament Textual Criticism. Extremely readable, extremely likable as far as I'm concerned. Scribes, Scrolls, and Scripture. It was just published last year. And you can see my copy's already getting worn out here. I've read it and I thoroughly enjoyed it. A Student's Guide to New Testament Textual Criticism. Scribes, Scrolls, and Scripture. Now, I would say in these two books, obviously you can tell they're paperback. We're talking about, 100 pages, 100 in that, 150 in that. I don't know that you would learn anything. I know you won't in this because it's written on a kind of a layman's level. I don't think you'll learn anything beyond what you already know or already have available in your notes or on the tapes. This one, you probably would find some new things just because we can only give so many references. If there are 200,000 variants in the New Testament, we don't even, touch the tip of the iceberg in covering those. You might find a few things there, but definitely in Metzger's big book here, you'll find a lot of stuff that we just have not had the time to cover. How readable is it? It's readable as far as I'm concerned. You don't have to really know Greek to read this. No, I don't see much in Greek until maybe when you get to the back, I think, and he'll start getting into various cases of variants, and he'll have the words written in Greek. But very interesting book. I'll leave those there. I'll get too many going around. Okay. We're going to have to start with the place that we started years ago, literally years ago, concerning methods and materials of writing. Methods and materials of writing. Some review, some new, some old. Methods and materials of writing. We introduced you those years ago and forever rid from your mind notions of big pens and notebook paper and clipboards and things like that, which obviously, if you thought about it, you would say, well, I know they didn't have a big pen, but if you don't think about it, it's in the back of your mind. They sat down with a pen and a piece of paper and wrote out a book of the Bible. You say, well, I'm intelligent enough to think about that. Well, most people aren't, though. And you weren't at one time. You thought they just... Well, how did they write the Bible? You couldn't have told anybody how they wrote the Bible, but with a piece of paper and a pen. Or maybe a pencil so you have an eraser at the end of it and you can erase and start over. Or a typewriter. You start with a typewriter. Maybe you wouldn't have thought of that. You thought some old crude form of a pen or something. Even if you thought of some quill pen or feather pen or something. This is how they did it. And had a bottle of ink and dipped in the ink and wrote on a piece of paper. Well, there are various methods and materials of writing in ancient days. There are such things, we'll just briefly go over some of this. There are such things as writing on stone. Different ways to write on stone. You could carve in the stone. I think it's Job chapter 19 that speaks of writing with the point of a diamond or with an iron stylus. Stylus is a technical term that you had to learn earlier in this class. S-T-Y-L-U-S. A metal stylus. You would carve in the stone. Something else you could do, according to Deuteronomy chapter 27, still regarding stones here, you could plaster the stone with mud. See, most people never think of this because we have different ways of recording things today. That's in Deuteronomy 27, if I remember correctly. Moses giving instructions to Joshua and the leaders of Israel, whenever you go into the promised land, then write the words of the law upon a stone. Joshua carries it out, by the way, at the end of Joshua chapter 8. And plaster the stone with mud on in northern Israel or central Israel, and write on that. There were tablets made out of wood that you could plaster with mud or wax. The tablets also could be made of stone. We're back to stone. What were the 10 Commandments written on? Tables of stone. It wasn't a rock that was fixed like in Deuteronomy 27 and Joshua 8. It was, we don't know what form, but it was some tablet, some slab of a stone that God had cut out, and the second time that Moses cut out, and then some writing was done upon it. The first time we're clearly told the finger of God, and it appears that the second time is something like the finger of God as well. So we're not too concerned about diamonds or a metal stylus or coating it with wax or something. But you could have a tablet of stone or of wood with wax or mud on it, and you would just put an imprint or draw a diagram, whatever form of writing, ideograms, pictograms, we discussed that earlier, that you desire to communicate by. Exodus 31:18 is an example of a stone tablet. We don't have any examples of wax tablets in the Bible that I know of, but they did exist. Other things would include potsherds. Potsherds were pieces of broken pottery, glazed or unglazed pottery, and when it was written upon, it was then technically known as an ostracon, or a plurality of them, the ostraca, just like it sounds. Ostracon, ostraca. It's a broken piece of pottery that then would be written upon with some form of ink or something. Job 2:8 speaks of Job using potsherds to scrape himself with. And it was a very, very popular form of writing. You have to understand that many of the household vessels were made out of some piece of clay. Jeremiah speaks of the potter at his wheel, remember? And once you had formed the clay, once it had been dried either in a kiln or in the sun, it became hard, and of course once you dropped it, it broke, and that was the end of it. And so you'd sweep all the pieces together and go carry them to the town dump and throw them in the dump. And pottery after pottery after pottery would pile up their broken pieces. And the poor people especially, or if you had a small message that had to be written down. Obviously you couldn't get a whole book of the Bible on a broken piece of pottery, but you would go and collect pieces of pottery, and you could then go home with whatever type of ink you were using or whatever type of writing you were using and make your impressions upon the ostracon. Then we get to probably the two most important things as far as biblical times were concerned, and that would be the papyrus plant and parchment. The papyrus, let's discuss this since this is our earliest our earliest material for writing of the biblical books. Parchment was invented later. Parchment was used for New Testament books beginning around the 4th century. Although I can add this, for the Old Testament era, it was a law that synagogue scrolls back in the Old Testament days, the synagogue scroll had to be written on a piece of parchment. So it was used at that time, but for some strange reason it was felt to be inferior. Of course, we learned later, and the world learned later, that it was not inferior, it was vastly superior to papyrus that had been used for so many centuries earlier. Over in the end of 2nd John and 3rd John, you have a reference to a piece of papyrus. Books like that, you see, could be written on one little piece. It can measure something like 9 by 10 inches. They didn't generally get more than 9 or 10 inches or so in height, and then you could always paste them together and begin to add on. A good length for a book in papyrus would be about 30 feet. The Gospel of Matthew, for instance, would fit on a roll of papyrus or a scroll of papyrus of about 30 feet long. I'm in 2 John verse 12. Having many things to write unto you, I would not write with paper and ink. Now, paper is a very poor translation. By the way, papyrus is the word from which we get our word paper, but it's a very poor translation because the wrong connotation comes to one's mind as you read something like this. You think of paper as we think of paper. And that's not true. It should be with papyrus. That's exactly what he's talking about, with papyrus and ink. We haven't said much about ink yet. I think the next one mentions that, verse 13 of the next book.
For the continuation of this message, please turn the tape over.
Verse 13 of the next book. I had many things to write, but I will not with ink and pen, and it's understood on a papyrus sheet, write unto thee. Well, there were different types of ink that's covered on tape before, made out of gall, vitriol, and so forth, a black sooty substance, and you would have a pen that could be something like what our old-fashioned quill pens were, where you would dip it in the ink and write on the piece of papyrus. This is earliest as far as the New Testament books are concerned, and was primarily used for the Old Testament books as well, except for the synagogue scrolls. Let's discuss a little about the papyrus plant then. The papyrus plant grew primarily in the Nile Delta, the swampy, reedy areas of the Nile, although it was also found in Israel. It was also found on the southern coast of Asia Minor, and it's been found in Costa Rica and other places since then. It's a tall, thin plant, could grow as high as 10 feet, had a bushy top on the top of it, long arms or legs or whatever you want to call them stretching outwardly. And what they would do, they'd make a living, as a matter of fact, the Egyptians would, and this was then taken to other parts of the world, and the Old Testament city of Gibel, which became known as Biblos because books from papyrus were composed there. People there, as well as people in Egypt, became very famous, and some people took that as a form of living, to go in little canoes out into the swampy area of the Nile and cut down these big, huge stalks. Now, it's interesting that the papyrus plant, you would think of it as being something round, like a carrot or something else. It's not. Whenever you cut it down and then look at it from an end angle, it has a triangular shape. I've read that the papyrus plants that are found in Los Angeles, that are grown there in the Arboretum, are completely round. They have the shape of a cylinder. In the Nile Delta area, it's not that way at all. They have a triangular shape. And of course, Egyptian superstition tells us it's because they were growing as a favor to the pyramids. And you know what the shape the pyramids are, because that's where they're found in that shape. It's really remarkable. But anyway, let's take something like your thumb. Something like your thumb would be about the size of it, and you'd strip off all the layer. Just like if you've ever whittled with a stick before. You whittle all the bark off, and what do you have? The inside white part, the stemmy part on the inside. Then you'd take it from the end, and from one of the ends, if we whittled it off, and would slice down this way. So you're going to end up with the piece on the front and the piece on the back. To you would kind of have a curve to it. And right when we get in the middle, then we're going to have two that have flat sides on both sides. Whenever you try to bend this, it would just snap off in your hands, like if you can bend in a good way a tip of a carrot or a piece of celery or something. It's got flexibility. It will bend. If you bend it the right way, it'll snap in half. They would snap fairly easily. You would have to put them in some water and keep for several days after you had cut these little strips, however long you want them. In other words, if the plant would grow 10 feet, you could cut it 10 times in and get 10 pages, 10 strips out of that, as far as we're talking about 10 inches up and down for the size of a piece of papyrus sheet. You put all that in water, whenever you bring it out, you can wrap it around your finger. And it's like hair or something. It won't break at all. You can just twirl it around your finger and it won't break at all. Then you lay down two different sections. You lay down the back section that runs vertically. You lay down the front section that runs horizontally and hammer them together. If you can picture what I'm talking about. And the glue that came, the natural resin that came out of the plant, would stick these things together. You'd have horizontal lines running on the front side so that obviously the person could write there. On the back side, they'd be running vertically. And it's like whenever you run into a bad piece of paper or a bad whatever, you have a hard time getting over that little bump. It smears your letter there. Do you remember what it's called technically whenever you write on the front and on the back? Okay, you're giving me sides, recto and verso. You're giving me front and back sides. Or those are the two names we need for front and for back. What about if it's written on both sides, though? What's it called? It appears one time, this is interesting, in Revelation, look at Revelation 5. Someone's got it, an epistograph. I saw on the right hand, this is unusual, Revelation 5. I saw on the right hand of him that sat on the throne a book written within and on the backside. That's unusual, because we know he's talking about the papyrus plant and sheets of papyrus here. And whenever you make them together, put them together, you end up with something, let's say, 10 inches tall and maybe 9 inches or so wide. You'd have the horizontal running on the front side and the vertical on the back side. So obviously you can write across if you've got horizontal lines that run like this. If you turn over and you've got up and down lines, you're going to have trouble getting across that. What's the meaning here of Revelation 5? Well, it must mean that he had so much information to get across that he had to write on the front and the back of the book. I mean, it has to have some meaning because books weren't written on the front and the back. They'd be written on the horizontal side, which was the inside, which was then rolled up inside the scroll. So you get an extra understanding of what's going on here. This must be very important material in this book sealed with 7 seals because it took the front and the back to write all of the material down. Whenever you finish with, let's say, a sheet 10 inches by 9 inches, then you could also take that sheet just before it dries and another sheet just before it dries, overlap them by a ½ inch or so, while they're still wet, gooey, gluey, moist from the water they've been soaking in, put them together and pound that as well. You can add on sheet after sheet after sheet. 30 feet was about as far as you'd want to go. You can realize how big 30 feet is to roll up in a scroll, and then to have to unroll it and read. I brought along a little example of some of these things. A scroll then was not like what a scroll was in Robin Hood days in England, where, you know, the crier or the herald or the proclaimer or whatever would come and stand and he would hold the scroll like this and rip it up and read this way. It's not read that way. It's, of course, read across this way. This is a miniature replica of the Isaiah scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And Old Testament was the same as the New. It would be opened this way. And this is what, a couple of feet or something? 30 feet. And you can see how much writing that holds on it. Of course, this is small. We're talking about something 10 inches by 9 inches. But that's exactly what the scrolls would look like. This is an exact duplicate or replica of the Isaiah scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Whenever I was in Cairo the last time, we went to a shop where they made papyrus sheets, and it was fascinating to watch how quickly it could be made. They're rather expensive. I'll pass this around for those of you that can see it. Be careful with it. I had to take it out of our frame at home. We have several of these at home to bring, but if you look at it carefully, you can see we're talking about, you almost have to look at it against the light or something. You can see we're talking about pieces of very thin, paper thin. That's how thin it is. It was it was a piece of stalk like that, and you pound the thing flat. Nowadays, you don't pound it with a hammer. You put it like in a big vise or something, a big press, and it's big enough to mash this whole sheet 10 by 9 inches, or these strips together, and it'll just mash it as flat as can be. And sit there and let it dry, and then all of this is hand done, and you can hand paint these things. I bought one of the smaller ones. They have huge ones that can go on your wall. It costs hundreds of dollars to buy. But if you look at this carefully, you'll see the two lines. I can see it from the back looking through it whenever you put it against the light. You can see the horizontal and the vertical lines. And then this is painted on here. It's an Egyptian scene of people in Egypt hunting and fishing the old-fashioned way. That's the same way. Those aren't papyrus plants. Too bad they aren't. I'd have a picture of that. That's exactly the way it would be done. You'd end up with a sheet something like this. This is exactly what the biblical material was written on. And then rather than painting pictures of Egypt, you would write the biblical text on there. Be careful because it is fragile. But they last for thousands and thousands of years, depending on, of course, what climate they're in. So I thought you'd find that interesting to bring some of that, since we're back on textual criticism. I've explained that to you before, but you can see better. If you'll hold it against a light, you'll be able to see how the lines run. The grain runs crisscross, and you've got to get it on the right side to get everything to pan out. Let's come with New Testament era, particularly in continuing to talk about papyrus. From around the 1st to the 4th century, papyrus was the material that was used. The manuscripts were done in what we call a scroll, which is being passed around somewhere out there. In other words, whenever you get the scroll, you look how smooth that paper is. And then you compare this. See, they didn't have paper like what that scroll is on. You've got to have sheets of papyrus put together and end up with your wrinkles and your rough spots here and there, and put all of that together. And then you'll end up with an official scroll. And the style of the letters was what was known as uncial letters. Do you remember what uncial means? Capitals. Uncials mean capitals. They were capital letters. We're talking about the Greek text right now. So, for instance, practically all of the early Greek texts, the manuscripts, abbreviated, remember, MSS, practically all of the early Greek manuscripts from the 1st to the 4th centuries are written entirely in capital Greek letters. Now, it's not true today. You know, we write with small letters, but they were written entirely with capital Greek letters with practically zero separation or spacing between words, sentences, paragraphs, and with practically zero punctuation, which makes it a little difficult to read, to say the least. That lasted up until the 4th century, when we have something new that's invented. That's what? Someone remember what's invented the 4th century? Okay, parchment. Now, parchment had been used earlier, but parchment really came to a place of perfection. Parchment is the skin of an animal. You could either have it from calf skin, or from a lamb, something like that. You'd end up with parchment, vellum. Today the words are almost used synonymously, parchment and vellum, but back then one had reference to one and one to the other. Where the hide of the animal would be taken off and then tanned. That didn't seem to work very well, and that passed off the scene pretty quickly. And the next thing, the hide of the animal was taken off and scraped on both sides. Similar to tanning, but the tanning didn't involve scraping off all of the hair and all of the hide. And this seemed to work a lot better. It gave us a soft, cloth-like material. If you've ever handled a piece of parchment or vellum before, it's a soft, it feels like a piece of material, like cotton or something in your hands. Very soft, very smooth. It can last a long time as well. Why people thought that it was inferior to papyrus, we really don't know, but they felt that way for quite some time. So from the 4th to the 10th century, parchment was the material that was used. No longer papyrus now. Parchment was the material. What else is different around this time? Codex was invented. The codex, the plural is the codice, a book form, similar to what we use as a book today. Scrolls began passing off the scene, except the official ones in the Jewish synagogues, and codices were used by the Christians to write their material, and the letters stayed the same, capitals, uncials. That lasted until about the 10th century. Then from the 10th to the 14th century, we have another change. What's the change now? From the 10th to the 14th century. Minuscules. Some of you remember a lot of that material. Minuscules. You can't get any better than a book form, a codex, codice, so that doesn't change. You certainly don't revert to papyrus. But we have another change here. We go from the capital letters of the uncial to the running hand of the people, similar to cursive, but it's known as minuscules. Minuscules. Then from that lasted to the 14th century, 10th to the 14th. Then from the 14th to the 15th, paper finally comes on the scene. We're still using minuscules. We're still using, or we're not using parchment now. We changed to paper. And we're still using the codices. Paper had been invented in the 1st century AD by the Chinese, used by people in the Middle East as early as the 7th century. The Arabs used it then, but really never made its way into Christian Europe until the 14th century, the 14th to the 15th century. And then what happens in the 15th century that revolutionizes the world of writing? The printing press, invented by Gutenberg. What was the very first thing to come from the printing press? Gutenberg Bible? No, someone says. A sheet of indulgence, right. A sheet of indulgence was the first thing, a small sheet of indulgence. And then the Gutenberg Bible, 1454, if I remember the date correctly. Gutenberg, the German printer, first printed Bible, and of course it was the Latin Vulgate. First printed Bible was in the Latin language, which I think we talked about on Sunday morning. He died penniless. There are 40 Gutenberg Bibles still left. I think one's down in the New York Public Library. There are 40 of these priceless treasures left. Since then, of course, things have just gotten better, but basically not the tremendous changes that we've seen earlier. Now that we have the invention of the printing press, which involves movable type, then everything is on the up and up after that. Let's go and take a look at the designation of the different types of manuscripts or source material that we have. There were the papyri. There were the uncials. Now, why do we make a separation here? What's the difference between the papyri and the uncials? I thought the papyri were written with uncial letters, weren't they? Weren't they? The papyri were written because the papyrus comes first, 1st to 4th century. Uncials, that's 4th to 10th. That's just because that was a technical name given to them then. But don't let it confuse you in thinking that, well, they must have written with minuscules on the papyri. No, the papyri was written with uncials. Then they changed in the 4th century to parchment and vellum. They still use uncials, but they took that name, uncials, as the technical name for manuscripts that would date from the 4th to the 10th century. The minuscules would be the next group from the 10th to the 14th century. Then there were things known as lectionaries, versions or translations, however you want to say it, and the patristic quotations. These are our sources. We're talking about the accuracy of the underlying text and the first step of a theory of translation. These are our half-dozen sources that we use for reconstructing as accurately as possible the text that appears to be closest to the original. The papyri, the uncials, the minuscules, the lectionaries, the versions, and the patristic quotations. Now, the old liberal cows out there just rant and rave about the very things we've been talking about tonight. How in the world can you trust your Bible here? Parts of it are 3,000 years old. A large section of it, the New Testament, is almost 2,000 years old. Translated from a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and you can finish that from the original autographs, from the original manuscripts. Now, how in the world can you hope to trust something like that? Well, one thing that the old liberal swine out there, and I don't mind calling them that because they're dishonest on a point like this, the liberals out there just praise Shakespeare, they praise Caesar, they praise all these other early famous writers. And let's look at a few statistics as far as those writings are concerned in comparison to the New Testament. The literary evidence for the New Testament is so far greater in quantity and earlier in history than all of these other famous works, it's almost beyond belief. In other words, the point in a study like this, we'll look at a few statistics here, would be that if you want to read a book that is as reliable as books can be. Not as far as its divine origin is concerned. Not as far as its authenticity is concerned. That is, the authority that God gave it whenever He gave the Scriptures. We're not even considering that. We're just considering the copy of it that we have today as opposed to thousands of years ago. If you want to compare that with today, what we had 1,000 years ago, there is no comparison between any book in the world and the Holy Scriptures. And I can prove that with the evidence. Let's look historically first. I said that the literary evidence for the New Testament is earlier in history than that for any other work in literature. In other words, we're talking about the space of time that elapses between the autograph, the date when the man lived, and the first copy that's extant today. We don't have autographs of anything, except maybe the last couple of hundred years here. We don't have autographs of the earliest. But the amount of time that has elapsed between the autograph, the date of the man, and the first copy that we have. The history of Herodotus, maybe some of you have read. A lot in the world today is based on all our understanding of ancient Greece and part of ancient Rome. It's based on the writings, the history of Herodotus. He lived in the 5th century BC. The earliest manuscript copy of his work that we have is the 10th century AD. 1,500 years separate the time of Herodotus from the earliest extant copy we have today. Think of all the mistakes that must have entered into the picture over those 1,500 years. And yet the liberals will base their life on Herodotus. They'll say the Bible's not reliable, but they'll base their life and their understanding of ancient Greek history on Herodotus. Virgil, the Roman poet who lived, just a little prior to the time of Christ. We only have one earlier manuscript that predates the 4th century AD. 400 years distance between the two. Caesar's Gallic Wars, the earliest copy existing today, 900 years after Caesar's day. Well, are you following the intent of this? How dishonest the liberals are out there. They just worship Julius Caesar, and they can tell you everything that happened in his Gallic Wars. On what basis? A manuscript that's 1,000 years past the time Julius Caesar lived? How really reliable is that then? See, how does that compare then with the New Testament? What's our earliest New Testament fragment? We don't have full manuscripts early. Our earliest fragment. Anyone remember the date of the earliest fragment? 125 AD, and it's of what? John, the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John has to be one of the later books that's written, maybe somewhere between 90 and 100 AD. We're talking about at a maximum 35 years and at a minimum 25 years. 25, not 25 centuries, not 1,000 years, not 14 or 1,500 years. 25 to 35 years separate the time of John and the writing of his Gospel and the earliest piece of manuscript that we have. It's known as the John Rylands Papyrus, 457, or we know it as P52. Then we have some in the Bodmer Papyri collection. Bodmer Papyri P66 dates around AD 200, and it's almost an entire complete copy of the Gospel of John. Most of the Bodmer Papyri are up into the P70s, and we have the Chester Beatty Papyri in the P40s. It's a remarkable difference then. What about quantity? The literary evidence for the New Testament as opposed to all the other ancient works of literature. The quantity. Well, we have fewer than 100 manuscripts of the following famous writers: Virgil, Cicero, Euripides. Fewer than 100 manuscripts. Virgil, Cicero, Euripides. Aeschylus, these are famous Greek and Roman playwrights and poets and so forth. Aeschylus, we have his plays in 50 manuscripts. Aeschylus. Aeschylus. I liked Aeschylus. I had to read Aeschylus in college. Sophocles, 100 manuscripts. Caesar's Gallic Wars, that are 1,000 years too late, really. 10 manuscripts, only 10. Caesar's Gallic Wars. Livy's History of Rome. How do we know Rome even existed back then? 20 manuscripts. What about the famous Roman writer Tacitus? Tacitus, Tacitus. We have his annals in 2 manuscripts. And people get PhD degrees in these things and feel so proud over it, and yet think the Bible's not reliable because it's a translation of a translation of a translation. The Peloponnesian Wars, 8 manuscripts. This last one might sound impressive. I'll put it last because it sounds impressive as far as the number is concerned, and it's probably more well known to most of you here than everything else that I've mentioned, and that's the Iliad. Remember Homer or pseudo-Homer, whether Homer really wrote it or not is beside the point. The Iliad exists in 453 papyri, 2 uncials, and 188 minuscules. 453 papyri, 2 uncials, 188 minuscules, for a total of 643 manuscripts.
This message will be continued on the following tape.